The somewhat recent introduction of NES emulation on the Switch through the Nintendo Switch Online service has brought to the fore discussions on how to best implement retro gaming on a modern console, particularly how to go about collecting and curating a large-scale collection of retro games in a single front end. But today, we're not really here to talk about how the Switch is bringing retro games to a larger audience than ever, or even how microconsoles like the ones that Nintendo and Sony have released recently are trying to clean up and commercialize what had usually been a homebrew scene led by the gray market in the past. Instead, we're going to look at a past attempt to bring a bunch of retro games together: Microsoft's Game Room project. Game Room first launched in March of 2010 with an extremely thin initial offering of games. There was some older arcade stuff, as well as games from the Atari 2600 and Intellivision consoles. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell most of you that games originally released on the 2600 and the Intellivision are usually not very playable today. There are a few standouts from that era, games like Pitfall 2, but a lot of it is barely playable trash. But yet, Game Room charged the exact same amount of money for every single game on its service. In other words, River Raid costs the exact same amount of money that bowling does. Still, despite some pricing issues and the disappointing initial set of releases, there was still some hope, even on my part at first, that these could just be growing pains, that eventually more prominent games would get signed to the service, and it might expand into something really neat. Ultimately, though, convincing rights holders to put their games on Game Room would always be the biggest challenge to the continued development of the service. Quite frankly, this is the generation of other services, like Nintendo's Virtual Console and Microsoft's own Xbox Live Arcade, allowing rights holders to put their old games out for whatever amount of money they wanted, with more of the cut going to them than it would in Game Room. It's likely that Konami figured its biggest games were worth more on their own instead of the lower price they'd be able to charge in Game Room, and they'd probably be right. And so, the games that did get added to Game Room were never that exciting, and in a lot of ways kinda got worse as time went on. So, Game Room games were pushed in batches to the platform. You get a big download, a big piece of DLC that had all the latest games, and sometimes they just feel like giant dumps of Intellivision sports games and shitty Atari 2600 versions of Checkers. There was never a new set of games that was released that I was excited for. But let's talk about how the eponymous Game Room actually works. Whenever you buy a game inside the platform, you're given a virtual arcade cabinet to place in one of your virtual rooms, of which you had many. And there was a lot of support for customization in that vein. Let's say you wanted to have a room filled with the best Atari games you owned. You just take those Atari cabinets, you place them in the room, and then all you have to do to complete the look is add an Atari theme to the room, and you're good to go. Of course, the problem with all of this stuff was that it was entirely aesthetic, and in some ways actually made navigating through all of your games somewhat more difficult. It wasn't even like you were playing as an avatar walking through the space. It was still just a menu. It was just a far clumsier menu than the actual one that you could access elsewhere. What really made Game Room the most appealing, though, was its universal set of leaderboards. You could compete on leaderboards for even the most obscure games on the service, though, of course, they did need to at least have some sort of scoring mechanic, which not every game on Game Room did. But you would actually have people to fight for position against in that game, just like you would against any opposing player in a real arcade, where even the most obscure cabinet tucked away in a corner somewhere still has high scores for you to compete against. Even if you weren't good enough to compete at that high level, Game Room did strive to make your experience better as well, with built-in rewind functionality in the platform's emulation, so you could reverse bad decisions or bad gameplay at will. You could even watch other players' replays in the game from the top of the leaderboards. But in order to get to all that real functionality, you had to fight through Game Room's entirely too complex pricing structure. If you paid Microsoft $5, you'd be able to play a single game on both the Xbox 360 and PC versions of Game Room. If you didn't care about playing it on both PC and 360, you could get any game for $3 for one or the other. If you really wanted the most accurate arcade experience, you could buy tokens for 25 cents a piece that you could pump into any game you wanted. And while being able to try before you buy certainly has its merits, having what was essentially a 3-tier pricing structure was extremely confusing. Add to that the fact that the vast majority of the games on the platform were simply not worth the trouble, and Game Room was doomed to failure from the start. Rights holders had no interest in doing something that, from their perspective, would cheapen their brand and cause them to lose out on potential profits. And so while it may have had some really neat features in its emulation and leaderboard systems, the endless fights over acquiring new games quickly sunk the service. A preview of the sorts of things that companies still have to deal with when making retro collections happen today. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on Game Room. If you liked this retrospective, you might like one of my other ones, like the one I did on the Halo franchise, or the one I did on PlayStation Home. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button, and if you want to see more like it in the future, be sure to hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.